There was only one person executed in the US in the month of May. Darryl Barwick was found guilty of murdering Rebecca Wendt and given the death penalty in 1986. Anne Wendt left her Panama City apartment early on March 31, 1986, to head to Fort Walton Beach. Anne's sister and roommate Rebecca Wendt stayed at the apartment building and lounged outside until around 11:45 a.m. Around 12:30 p.m., a different apartment complex resident who was also outside tanning noticed a man wandering around the property. The witness claimed she observed the man approach the Wendts' flat and then leave their building and enter the woods. She later identified him as Darryl Barwick. Rebecca's body was discovered in the bathroom of the flat on the evening of March 31st when her sister came home. It was covered in a blanket. Bloody footprints and fingerprints were seen throughout the flat by the investigators who were called to the location, as well as the victim's wallet and purse. Rebecca had been stabbed multiple times and her swimming suit was displaced. She suffered 37 stab wounds to her upper body, as well as several defensive wounds to her hands, according to an autopsy. The medical examiner came to the conclusion that the neck, chest, and abdominal wounds were most probably fatal ones, and that death would have happened 3 to 10 minutes after the initial stabbing.
The Bay County Sheriff's Office and the Springfield Police Department are looking into Monday evening's stabbing death of 24-year-old Rebecca Wendt. Wendt was visiting her sister and was staying in her sister's apartment on Russ Lake Drive. Sheriff Lavelle Pitts speculates that Wendt was sunbathing during the afternoon hours, and it's possible the murder wasn't discovered for some time.
It appeared that some intruder come into the house. Possibly the girl was laying out in the yard, sunning, and someone could have come in when she started back in the house. And it was evident that a tremendous struggle took place. There was evidence of that she fought, all over the house. And that's about all we can tell you at this time. We don't know how long that she was dead, before members of her family come in and found her.
Crime scene investigators were on the scene this morning to continue the search for evidence. Sheriff Pitts is also asking the public's help in this case.
The victim's blanket had a genetic material stain on it, which a crime lab analyst discovered, despite the examiner finding that there was no assay on the victim. After the genetic material was examined and compared with Barwick's blood, it was concluded that Barwick fit within 2% of the population that may have generated the stain. Barwick first told detectives he had nothing to do with Rebecca's murder. However, he admitted to committing the act after being apprehended on April 15th. He claimed that following his observation of Rebecca sunbathing, he drove back to his residence, parked the car, got a knife, and then made his way back to the apartment building where he had first seen Rebecca. He followed her into her apartment after passing her 3 times. Rebecca fought, and Barwick said he was merely trying to steal something. However, when she struggled, he lost control and stabbed her. As the two wrestled and went to the ground, Rebecca was still being stabbed, according to Barwick. Darryl Barwick was born on September 29, 1966, and he was just 19 years and a half when he committed this crime. He had previously been imprisoned for assay and burglary, and he had been out of prison for barely 3 months when he murdered Rebecca Wendt.
Tuesday afternoon, Darryl Brian Barwick was arrested for the stabbing death of Rebecca Wendt. This morning, he was officially charged with first-degree murder and armed burglary. Circuit Judge Don T. Sermons read the charges.
The affidavit states the defendant entered the residence of Rebecca Wendt and while armed with a knife did assault the victim by stabbing her 38 times.
Also present for first appearance was Assistant State Attorney Harry Harper. Sheriff Lavelle Pitts has praised the cooperation that his department received from investigators from the State Attorney's Office. Frank McKeithen, the chief case officer for the Barwick arrest, was in court on behalf of the Sheriff's Department. Judge Sermons appointed public defender Mike Stone to represent Barwick. Barwick was ordered held without bail and will return to offer a plea in the case on June 18th.
102 people have been put to death in Florida since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Barwick last month. His execution was the third one planned for Florida this year, following a pause that began in 2019. Barwick's lawyers argue that the execution should be put on hold due to his ongoing mental illness and intellectual incapacity in their last appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. The appeal was denied.
Death row inmate Darryl Barwick is down to his last appeal in his attempt to avoid execution tomorrow night. Friday, his attorneys appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court asking for the stay of execution. They cited what they called the state's failure to give Barwick a fair chance at clemency. That argument has already been rejected by several other state and federal courts. The appeal came on the same day that the Florida Supreme Court rejected Barwick's motion for a stay of execution. Not only did justices affirm the circuit court's conviction and death sentence, but they also said they would not consider any more of Barwick's appeals. Barwick killed 24-year-old Rebecca Wendt at a Russ Lake apartment unit back in September of '86. He was 19 years old at the time. The jury at his 1987 trial recommended the death penalty, as did the jury at his '92 retrial. Governor Ron DeSantis signed Barwick's death warrant on April the 3rd. Barring a last-minute stay, Barwick will die by lethal injection at 6 o'clock Eastern Time tomorrow night. He'll be the first Bay County death row inmate to be put to death since capital punishment was reinstated in Florida all the way back in 1976.
According to Florida Department of Corrections officials, Darryl Barwick woke up at 4:15 in the morning and he was in good spirits. His last meal was at 9:15 a.m. and he chose to eat fried chicken, mac and cheese, black-eyed peas, rice, and cornbread, which he paired with a cola. For dessert, he chose strawberry ice cream. Before his scheduled execution at 6 o'clock in the evening, jail officials reported that although Barwick had not interacted with his family members in person, he had recently spoken to them on the phone. According to officials, no family members of the victim were scheduled to attend the execution. Before being given a lethal injection, Darryl Barwick made a brief statement. He was already tied to a table and covered with a sheet in the execution chamber when the screen was raised. The intravenous lines were already in place on his left arm, and only the face and the arm were visible. His last words were, "It's time to apologize to the victim's family and to my family. I can't explain why I did what I did. And another thing I would like to say, the state of Florida needs to show some kind of compassion and kindness for each other with so many kids in prison. There are 14 and 15-year-olds serving life sentences." In addition to the 4 press representatives and employees of the Florida Department of Corrections, there were 17 official witnesses present. After he was done speaking, a staff member declared that the preparatory stage of the execution was over and that the execution phase was about to start. At 6:02 p.m., the lethal mix of 3 drugs, a sedative, a paralytic, and the medication to stop his heart, began to be administered. Throughout the process, he kept his eyes open. Barwick's left arm began to twitch shortly after he started breathing heavily for several minutes, with his chest visibly rising and falling. Barwick was approached by employees at 6:06 but remained silent despite keeping his eyes open. A member of the execution team's medical staff declared Barwick dead at 6:14 p.m. after only 12 minutes.
The sentence of the state of Florida versus Darryl Brian Barwick was carried out at 6:14 p.m. The execution took place without incident.
Up until Wednesday, the state of Florida had executed 101 death row inmates. Wednesday evening, 56-year-old Darryl Barwick became number 102, executed by lethal injection. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his last hope for a stay of execution earlier in the day. Prison officials say Barwick was calm and in good spirits around 9:15 Wednesday morning when he received his last meal. Afterward, he consulted with a spiritual leader, then waited. Around 5 o'clock, the execution process began, with Barwick being prepared, strapped to a table, and transported to the execution chamber. At 6 o'clock, nearly 3 dozen official witnesses, media, and Department of Corrections officials gathered in a viewing room to watch the state carry out the sentence. At 6:02, the execution team began the lethal injection process. 5 minutes later, Barwick slipped into unconsciousness. At 6:14, a medical professional pronounced him dead. Rebecca Wendt's family did not attend the execution. None of the witnesses had a personal connection to the case. From the time they entered the room until the time they left, no one said a word. No one looked away, and no one displayed any emotions.
This is a case where there has never been a doubt about the defendant's guilt. Not one, but two juries found the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and recommended that he be sentenced to death. Unfortunately, it took 37 years from the time of the crime for that punishment to be carried out in this case. We appreciate the tireless efforts of the Attorney General's office and Governor DeSantis' office to obtain justice for the victim and her family.
The governor of Florida dropped the requirement for recommending the death penalty in the state this month, allowing jurors to do so without unanimous consent. Only 8 out of the 12 jurors must propose the death penalty under new laws approved by the legislature. Additionally, DeSantis signed a bill this week that makes essay of a kid under the age of 12 a crime punishable by the death sentence. Both bills received public support from the governor. Another person that was scheduled to be executed in May was Richard Glossip, and I was constantly checking for updates regarding his case. Just last week, the Supreme Court decided to block his execution. The state's Attorney General, Mr. Drummond, made a remarkable decision in his letter, saying that the state had come to the difficult but essential conclusion that Glossip's capital conviction is unsustainable and a new trial is imperative. The stay issued by the Supreme Court will remain in place while the justices decide whether to hear Glossip's appeal, and if they do, until they decide its outcome. The case of Richard Glossip has been controversial to say the least. Barry Van Trees was killed by Justin Sneed on January 7, 1997, with a baseball bat. The murder took place at the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City, where Glossip was the manager, Sneed was the maintenance worker, and Van Trees was the hotel's owner. Sneed confessed and admitted to the police that Glossip had given him the order to kill the victim in exchange for being spared the death penalty. Glossip resisted taking a plea deal because he claimed he was truly innocent. A jury in Oklahoma found Glossip guilty of the murder in July 1998, and they also gave him the death penalty. The conviction was overturned in 2001 by the unanimous Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, which described the prosecution's evidence as very poor and said Glossip had had unconstitutionally inadequate legal representation. A second Oklahoma jury found Glossip guilty of the murder in August 2004 and gave him the death penalty again. Glossip claimed that his defense attorney had resigned because of intimidation by the prosecution. However, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the death penalty in April 2007, with 2 judges voting in favor, 1 judge specifically concurring, and 2 judges against. Sister Helen Prejean advocated for Glossip, but she was unsuccessful in persuading the Clemency Board to take into account letters from Sneed's relatives who think Sneed was lying. Glossip was almost entirely convicted based on Sneed's testimony, which he used to avoid the death penalty himself. I'm curious to know, what do you guys think about Richard Glossip's case? Was he really wrongfully convicted, or did he actually plan the murder of his former boss? There are no other death warrants signed for the month of May, but for the month of June there are 2 people waiting to be executed. These people are Alabama death row inmate James Barber and Missouri prisoner Michael Tessius. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.